He sat alone at the corner booth, still in his army jacket, just trying to eat a meal in peace. He had survived multiple tours in Afghanistan. He had carried wounded soldiers off battlefields under enemy fire. He had buried brothers. But nothing, not the IEDs, not the ambushes, not the long nights in Kandahar, had prepared him for what unfolded inside a small-town Georgia diner one afternoon. And when the handcuffs came out, he made one quiet phone call. Soon after, two police officers would be fighting to save their careers. This is the story of Vance Caldwell and the day everything changed. One ordinary morning began the way most mornings did for Vance Caldwell. Quietly, with a kind of hollow stillness that civilians never quite understood and veterans never quite escaped. Vance was in his early 40s. He stood 6'1", broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair that had begun going silver at the temples since his last deployment. He wore his old Army field jacket, olive drab, frayed at the left cuff, not out of nostalgia, but because it was the only jacket he owned that still fit the way clothes were supposed to fit a man, with purpose. He did not wear it to be recognized. He did not wear it to be thanked. He wore it because it was warm, and because on some mornings it was the only thing that reminded him of who he used to be before the war took pieces of him that no VA counselor had ever been able to fully return. Vance had driven into Morrow Falls, Georgia, a small city of about 40,000 people nestled between Atlanta's suburban sprawl and the flat agricultural flatlands of middle Georgia, to handle a single errand. His sister, Lena Caldwell Holbrook, lived 20 minutes outside of town, on a property she shared with her husband, Travis Holbrook, and their two kids. Lena had called Vance 2 nights before, crying. The furnace had gone out. Travis's back had flared up again, an old construction injury that left him bedridden for days at a time. And Lena needed Vance to drive down from his apartment and help her navigate the warranty paperwork with the HVAC company's local representative, a man who had a reputation for making things complicated when he thought he could get away with it. Vance had handled the representative in minutes flat. He was good at cutting through nonsense. The Army had taught him that much. With the morning's business done and Lena's kids fed and settled in front of a movie, Vance told his sister he would grab a meal before heading back north on the highway. Lena had offered to make him lunch, but he had waved her off. "You've got enough going on," he told her. "I'll find something on the way." He spotted Sawyer's Diner from the highway exit. It was the kind of place that used to define American roadside culture. A squat, low-slung building with a red and white awning, a handwritten specials board in the window, and a parking lot full of pickup trucks and work vans. A small cardboard sign in the door read, "Family Owned." Vance liked places like that. They reminded him of the diner his grandmother used to take him to as a boy in Columbus, Ohio, a place where the coffee was cheap and strong, and the woman behind the counter knew your name within 2 visits. He pulled his truck into the lot, locked it, and walked in. The interior of Sawyer's was warm and smelled of bacon grease and fresh biscuits. About a dozen tables filled the space, half of them occupied. A few locals sat at the counter on swiveling stools. Country music played low from a speaker mounted near the register. Vance noticed several customers glance up when he walked in. Not unusual, not alarming. He was a large man walking into a small diner. That always generated a look or two. The hostess, a woman in her 30s with auburn hair pinned up under a Sawyer's Diner cap, gave him a distracted smile and told him to sit anywhere. Vance chose the corner booth near the window. He liked corners. Old habit. You could see the door from the corner, and you always wanted to see the door. A waitress named Linda Sawyer, whose name tag identified her as such and who Vance would later learn was the daughter-in-law of the diner's founder, appeared at his table within a minute. She was friendly enough, in her mid-50s, with a practiced efficiency that comes from years on the floor of a busy diner. She handed him a laminated menu without meeting his eyes, took his coffee order, and disappeared. Vance ordered the country breakfast, 2 eggs over medium, grits, biscuits, and a side of sausage. He pulled out his phone and opened a news app while he waited. One hand curled around the warm ceramic mug, shoulders beginning to drop their tension for the first time all morning. He had no idea what was already in motion. The trouble started with a phone call that Vance did not make and a complaint that had no basis. In fact, according to the records that would later be obtained through a public information request filed by attorney Tessa Langford of the Georgia Civil Rights Advocacy Project, a call was placed to the Morrow Falls Police Department non-emergency line. The caller, who identified herself as a customer at Sawyer's Diner, claimed that a large black male in military clothing was acting suspiciously, had been staring at people, and that she felt uncomfortable. That was the entirety of the complaint. No threats, no altercation, no raised voices, no weapon. A man sitting in a diner drinking coffee, looking at his phone, waiting for eggs. The dispatcher who took the call logged it as a suspicious person report, a category that in Morrow Falls' own procedural guidelines required the responding officers to assess the situation on arrival before taking any action. The guidelines were clear. They were also, as would be revealed later, frequently ignored. 2 officers were dispatched. Officer Garrett Harlan had been with the Morrow Falls Police Department for several years. He was in his mid-30s, white, stocky, with a square jaw and the kind of rigid posture that some men develop when they have been given a small amount of authority and have decided it represents everything. His file contained prior complaints of excessive force, all dismissed through the department's internal review process, which was at the time overseen by his direct supervisor, Sergeant Everett Dougal, who was also his uncle by marriage. The second officer was Reese Delaney, who had been on the force for a couple of years. He was newer, quieter, but had developed a habit of following Harlan's lead with a kind of uncritical loyalty that would cost him dearly before this story was over. The 2 officers pulled their cruiser into Sawyer's Diner parking lot. They sat in the vehicle for a short time before going inside. Harlan, according to later testimony, told Delaney before they got out of the car, "Let's see what this guy's about." It was a casual statement. It was also, in the context of everything that followed, a revealing one. The assessment had already been made. The investigation had not even started. Vance Caldwell was several bites into his biscuit when the bell above the diner door rang and 2 uniformed officers walked in. He did not look up immediately. Cops walked into diners. It was not unusual. He heard the footsteps, though. Training never leaves you. And he tracked them by sound as they moved through the space. They passed the counter. They did not sit down. They kept moving toward the back of the room, toward him. Vance set his fork down. Harlan stopped at the edge of Vance's table. Delaney positioned himself at a slight angle to Vance's left, a bracketing technique used to prevent a person from easily exiting a space. Vance recognized it immediately. He had been trained to do the exact same thing in tactical situations overseas. "Sir," Harlan said, and the word carried no courtesy. It was the weaponized version of the word, the version that meant, "I am addressing you formally because I am about to do something to you. Can I see some ID?" Vance looked at both of them steadily. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He did not make any sudden movements. All of this was deliberate. "Can I ask what this is about?" Vance said. "We received a complaint," Harlan said. "I need to see your ID." "A complaint about what, sir?" "I am not going to ask again." Vance reached slowly into his jacket pocket, making sure both officers could see exactly what he was doing. The way you learn to do when you know that the speed of a reach can be misinterpreted. And withdrew his wallet. He placed it on the table and slid his Georgia driver's license across. Harlan picked it up without looking at it. He was watching Vance's face instead. He was not actually running a license check in his head. He was looking for something to escalate. "What is the nature of your business here today?" Harlan asked. "I am eating breakfast," Vance said. "You live in Morrow Falls?" "No." "What brings you out here?" "Who is your family?" And that was the moment Vance understood exactly what was happening, because these were not the questions of a lawful investigation. These were the questions of a man fishing. They had no probable cause. They had received a call from someone who had described a black man sitting in a diner and called it suspicious. And now they were standing at his table, bracketing him, demanding he justify his existence in a public space. Vance folded his hands on the table. He breathed once slowly. "Officer," he said, "I know my rights. I am not required to answer questions beyond identifying myself, which I have done. I am not creating any disturbance. I am eating a meal at a public establishment. Unless you have a specific lawful reason to detain me, I would like to finish my food." The diner had gone quiet. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of quiet where everyone swivels on cue, but the gradual, uncomfortable kind where conversations taper off one by one as people realize something is happening nearby that they cannot ignore. Harlan's expression did not change, but something tightened behind his eyes. "Stand up, sir." "I am sorry?" "I am asking you to stand up."
Why?
"Because I am telling you to." What happened next unfolded in moments, but those moments would be replayed in courtrooms, city council chambers, news broadcasts, and thousands of online videos for months afterward. Vance Caldwell did not stand up. Not out of defiance exactly, or at least not purely out of defiance. He remained seated because he was a man who understood the law, who had spent time reading about his rights during the long stretches of nothing that come between deployments, who had talked to veterans advocates and legal aid volunteers, and who knew with the quiet certainty of a man who has been in this situation before that he was not legally obligated to comply with an unlawful order. He also knew that standing up in that moment could be used against him, that his size, his jacket, his blackness, all of it, would be framed by someone somewhere as threatening if he rose to his full height while two officers were already on edge. So he sat and he looked at Harlan directly. "Officer," Vance said, keeping his voice level and deliberate, "I have not committed any crime. I have not made any threats. I have not disturbed anyone in this establishment. You have no lawful basis to order me to stand. I am asking you respectfully to tell me the specific legal grounds for this interaction." "You are being detained," Harlan said. "On what grounds?" "Suspicious behavior." "Define the behavior." Harlan stepped forward. "Sir, I am not going to debate the law with you in the middle of a diner. Stand up now." "Garrett," that was Delaney's voice, low, uncertain. A single word. His partner's name carrying about 15 different kinds of doubt inside it. Harlan did not acknowledge it. "Stand up," Harlan said again. "No," Vance said, and he reached for his phone. That was when things accelerated. Harlan's hand moved to Vance's wrist before the phone was fully off the table. Not a grab that broke anything. Not a slam, but a grip. Firm, deliberate, controlling. "Do not touch me," Vance said. And this time, there was something different in his voice. Not anger, precision. Like a switch had been flipped from civilian to soldier in the space of a syllable. "Put the phone down," Harlan said. "I am calling my attorney. You are not calling anyone. That is a constitutional right you are currently violating." The other customers in the diner were not looking away anymore. An older couple in the booth across the aisle had both turned fully toward the confrontation. Linda Sawyer stood frozen at the edge of the counter, a coffee pot in one hand, her expression cycling between confusion and alarm. A young man, college age, wearing a Georgia Tech hoodie, had his phone out and was recording. Harlan saw the phone recording. It did not slow him down. "Stand up or I am placing you under arrest." "For what charge?" Vance asked. "Obstruction." "Of what?" "Of a lawful police investigation." "This is not a lawful investigation. You received an anonymous complaint that I was sitting in a restaurant. That is not probable cause for detention. That is not probable cause for arrest. And the moment you put handcuffs on me, you are going to have a very serious problem." Harlan reached for his cuffs. The click of them coming off the belt was the loudest sound in the diner. Vance looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Delaney, who had taken a half step back without seeming to realize it. Then he looked down at the phone on the table. "I am going to make one phone call," Vance said quietly. You can arrest me after that, but you are going to want to hear this call first. Harlan had the cuffs open. His hand was reaching for Vance's arm. Make your call, he said with the condescending tolerance of a man who has never been wrong about anything in his own estimation. Vance picked up the phone. He scrolled through his contacts with the unhurried calm of a man who has waited out sniper fire and has no particular fear of a moment like this. He found the name he was looking for. He pressed call. He placed the phone on the table, face up on speaker, and folded his hands in front of it. It rang 3 times. Then a voice came through the speaker, a voice that was deep, authoritative, and utterly unmistakable to anyone who had spent any time in the military or in certain corridors of Georgia state government. Vance, you okay, son? The voice on the phone belonged to Brigadier General Elias Whitfield, retired United States Army, former commander of the 3rd Infantry Division's 1st Brigade Combat Team, recipient of the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and the Bronze Star with Valor Device, and as of months prior, the appointed director of the Georgia State Veterans Commission. Elias Whitfield was in his early 60s. He was known in military and government circles as a man who had 2 settings: composed and absolutely terrifying. He was also, as it happened, the man who had written Vance Caldwell's letter of commendation following the action in the Korangal Valley, during which Vance, then a staff sergeant, had carried 2 wounded soldiers through active enemy fire to a casualty collection point, taking a round to the left shoulder in the process. Whitfield had been Vance's commanding officer. He had also, over the years, become something closer to family. Vance had called him because Elias Whitfield's other title, the one that mattered most in this specific moment, was board member of the Morrow Falls Police Department Civilian Oversight Panel, a position he had held as part of a state initiative to improve veteran law enforcement relations in rural Georgia. He knew this department. He knew its structure. And as it would turn out, he knew Garrett Harlan's name. General Whitfield, Vance said, his voice carrying clearly in the silent diner. I am at Sawyer's Diner in Morrow Falls. I am currently being detained by officers Garrett Harlan and Reese Delaney. Officer Harlan has his handcuffs out. I have not committed any crime. I have provided my identification and I have been informed that I am being arrested for obstruction. I wanted you to be aware of the situation. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted a few seconds. Put Officer Harlan on the phone. Harlan had gone completely still. The handcuffs were in his hand but not moving. His face had not changed expression, but there was something happening behind it. A rapid internal recalibration that he was trying very hard not to show. Sir, Vance said to Harlan with absolute courtesy, General Whitfield would like to speak with you. Harlan did not move for a moment. Then he reached down and picked up the phone. This is Officer Garrett Harlan, he said. What Elias Whitfield said to him in the next moments has never been fully disclosed. Whitfield declined to discuss the specifics in subsequent interviews, saying only that he made the situation clear. Linda Sawyer, who was close enough to catch fragments, later told Tessa Langford's investigators that she heard the following. Do you understand what you have done? I know your sergeant. You're going to unclip those cuffs and step back. I have been on the phone with the chief's office. Harlan's face, by all accounts, went through a transformation that several witnesses later struggled to describe accurately. The word most of them settled on independently was gray. His face went gray. He handed the phone back to Vance without a word. Vance, Whitfield's voice came through the speaker again. You sit tight. Chief Aldridge is being contacted right now. Do not say anything else to these officers. Do not move from that table. Help is on the way. Yes, sir, Vance said. He ended the call. He placed the phone back on the table. He picked up his fork and took a bite of his grits, which had gone cold. Harlan stood at the edge of the table, handcuffs still in his hand, and seemed to be experiencing the particular and unpleasant sensation of realizing all at once that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. Delaney had taken more steps back. He had removed his hand from his belt entirely. He looked, by multiple accounts, like a man who was trying to remember whether he had left the stove on at home, distracted by something internal and increasingly panicked. The college student in the Georgia Tech hoodie was still recording. Chief Marcus Aldridge arrived at Sawyer's Diner soon after Vance's phone call to Elias Whitfield. Marcus Aldridge was in his late 50s, with years on the Morrow Falls force, the last several as chief. He was a compact man with a white mustache and the permanently tired eyes of someone who has spent decades trying to steer a mid-sized police department through budget cuts, personnel crises, and the increasingly complicated terrain of modern American policing. He was not a perfect chief. No such thing exists. But he was, by the accounts of most people who knew him, a man who genuinely cared about the institution he ran and understood more than some of his officers that the institution's credibility was its most fragile asset. He walked into the diner flanked by two other officers, not Harlan's crew, but two senior officers he had specifically requested. He saw Vance Caldwell immediately. He saw Garrett Harlan standing at the edge of the table, handcuffs still in hand. He saw the phone recording it all on the nearby table. He saw the frozen tableau of an entire diner full of witnesses. He walked directly to Harlan. "Give me those," he said quietly and held out his hand. Harlan looked at him. He placed the handcuffs in Aldridge's palm. Aldridge clipped them to his own belt. Then he turned to Vance Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "my name is Marcus Aldridge. I am the chief of this department. I apologize for what happened here today." Vance studied him for a moment. "Apologize how, Chief?" "I mean it sincerely and officially." "I appreciate that," Vance said, "but I want you to understand. I have been asked to stand up for no legal reason. I have had handcuffs produced in my direction while I was eating breakfast, and I have about a dozen people in this diner who saw the whole thing. I am not going to let an apology be the end of this." "I am not asking it to be," Aldridge said, and for the first time, Vance saw something in a law enforcement officer's eyes that he had not expected to see in that diner that day. Genuine discomfort at what his department had done. Whether it was discomfort born of moral clarity or political calculation, Vance could not yet tell, but it was real. Aldridge turned to Harlan and Delaney. "Both of you," he said, "back to the station now. Leave your cruiser. Sergeant Thorpe will handle transport." Harlan opened his mouth. "Don't," Aldridge said. One word. Final. Harlan closed his mouth. He and Delaney walked out of the diner without speaking. The bell above the door rang as they left. The diner erupted. Not in cheers exactly, but in the release of held breath that sounds like a crowd coming back to life. People began talking again. The college student with the phone lowered it for the first time, looked at his screen, and appeared to be reading comments. The video, it turned out, had been streaming live the whole time. Linda Sawyer appeared at Vance's table with a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of hot biscuits. "These are on the house," she said. Her voice was shaking slightly. I am sorry I did not say anything. I should have said something." "You did not do anything wrong," Vance told her. "I should have said something," she repeated, and she walked away. And Vance was fairly certain she was crying. Chief Marcus Aldridge sat down across from Vance without asking permission, which was a bit presumptuous, but which Vance allowed, because the man had just handled a difficult situation with more grace than Vance had expected. "General Whitfield told me about your service," Aldridge said. "I would rather this not be about my service," Vance said. "It should not have happened to me because I am a veteran. It should not have happened to me because I am a human being who was eating breakfast." Aldridge looked at him. "You are right," he said. "You are completely right." By afternoon, the video from Sawyer's Diner had been shared thousands of times. By nightfall, it had been viewed by millions of people. By the following day, it had reached even more, had been covered by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, picked up by NBC News National Desk, and generated a segment on CNN's afternoon block. The headline that ran most consistently across platforms was some variation of, "Georgia cops attempt to arrest black veteran for eating breakfast." Then a phone call stops everything. The young man who had filmed it, his name was Jasper Blevins, a college junior at Georgia Tech who had been in Morrow Falls visiting his grandmother, had not intended to become the center of a national news story. He had seen something that felt wrong, done what his generation does instinctively, and posted it. By the next morning, he had been interviewed by several local television stations and had received a call from a producer at Good Morning America, but the video was only the beginning. Tessa Langford, the attorney, had been contacted by a veterans advocacy group called the Georgia Shield Project, a nonprofit that provided legal representation to veterans facing civil rights issues, within hours of the video going viral. Tessa was in her mid-40s, a former public defender who had pivoted to civil rights work after a case in her late 30s had radicalized her sense of what justice actually required. She was brilliant, meticulous, and according to opposing counsel who had faced her in court, exhaustingly well prepared. She took Vance's case the same evening it broke publicly. Within days, Tessa had filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, requested all body camera footage from the incident, obtained the dispatch records showing the nature of the original complaint, and begun building a timeline of Garrett Harlan's previous conduct with the Morrow Falls Police Department. What she found in that timeline was worse than anyone had publicly known. Harlan's prior complaints, the ones that had been dismissed through Sergeant Everett Dougal's internal review, were not minor. The first involved an incident in which Harlan had been accused of using a chokehold on a handcuffed suspect outside a convenience store. The second involved allegations that Harlan had planted a small amount of marijuana on a Latino teenager during a traffic stop, allegations that the teenager's family had pursued and then dropped after being unable to afford continued legal representation. The third involved a black woman named Maya Gaines who had called the police for help after a car accident and alleged that Harlan had handcuffed her instead of the other driver, detaining her for minutes with no clear explanation, then released her without charges. Maya Gaines had tried to file a complaint. It had been reviewed by Sergeant Everett Dougal. It had been dismissed within days. Tessa found Maya Gaines. Maya Gaines was willing to talk. She also found the family of the Latino teenager. They were willing to talk too, and she found several other former and current Morrow Falls residents, some of them black, some Latino. One, a homeless white veteran named Donovan Finch, who had been roused by Harlan from a public park bench multiple times, who had stories that rhymed with Vance's in ways that were too consistent to be coincidence. The picture that emerged was not of a single bad day or a single bad judgment call. It was of a system, small, local, and insular, that had been enabling a pattern of targeted harassment for years, protected by familial connection and institutional indifference. Sergeant Everett Dougal had dismissed every complaint that landed on his desk involving Garrett Harlan. Every single one over the years, not one had been sustained. When Tessa requested Dougal's personnel file and cross-referenced it with Harlan's, she found something else. Dougal had personally supervised Harlan's field training when Harlan first joined the force. He had written his evaluation. He had recommended his promotion. He had, in effect, built Garrett Harlan from the ground up, and Dougal was his uncle by marriage. Chief Marcus Aldridge, when presented with a summary of Tessa's preliminary findings at a meeting in his office days after the diner incident, a meeting he had requested, which was itself a signal, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I did not know all of this." "That is the problem," Tessa told him. "You should have." What happened next happened fast, and it happened hard, and it happened in ways that none of the people who had been comfortable in their corners of this story had anticipated. Garrett Harlan was placed on administrative leave pending investigation soon after the diner incident. It was a standard procedural step, and many people who had seen the video assumed it would amount to nothing, that Harlan would take a paid vacation, let the news cycle move on, and return to duty in weeks. That assumption did not account for Elias Whitfield. Whitfield, in his role as a board member of the Civilian Oversight Panel, had the authority to request an independent investigation. one conducted not by the department's internal affairs division, but by an external firm with no relationship to Morrow Falls PD. He exercised that authority within hours of the incident. The firm he selected was based in Atlanta, which specialized in law enforcement conduct reviews and had an impeccable reputation for thoroughness. The lead investigator assigned was a woman named Naomi Satchfield, in her early 50s, former GBI agent with a reputation in her field that can only be described as formidable. Naomi Satchfield did not cut corners. She did not accept explanations that were not supported by documentation, and she had a particular talent for making police officers, who had spent years saying very little, say a great deal more than they intended to. Reese Delaney cracked first. To be precise, Delaney did not wait to be cracked. He walked into Naomi Satchfield's office in Atlanta on an early day of the investigation with a lawyer, a young public defender named Greg Fontaine, and he told them everything he knew. Delaney was in his late 20s. He had joined the force because he genuinely wanted to do good work. He had spent years watching Garrett Harlan operate and had told himself over and over that it was not his place to interfere, that Harlan was experienced and he was new, that the system would self-correct. The diner had broken something in him that he had not known was already cracked. He described in hours of recorded testimony a pattern of conduct by Harlan that went significantly beyond anything in the official complaint files. He described specific incidents he had witnessed. A black teenager stopped on a bicycle and searched without cause. An elderly black man detained outside a pharmacy on an allegation Delaney later confirmed was fabricated. A series of what Harlan called attitude adjustments, off-record stops of people he had decided needed to be reminded of their place. He also described a conversation he had had with Everett Dougal after the Maya Gaines incident, in which Dougal had told him explicitly, "Whatever Garrett handles in the field, you do not see it. That is how this works." Delaney had a near-perfect memory for dialogue. He admitted, been keeping notes on his personal phone for months because somewhere in the back of his mind, he had known that a day was coming. Naomi Satchfield looked at the notes. Then she looked at Delaney. "Why did you not come forward before?" she asked. Delaney was quiet for a long time. "Because I was afraid," he said, "and because I told myself it was not bad enough yet, and then it got bad enough." The notes, combined with the other evidence Tessa had compiled, formed the spine of what became, in the weeks that followed, a formal criminal referral to the Georgia Attorney General's office. The referral named 3 individuals: Garrett Harlan, Everett Dougal, and a third name that surprised many people: the owner of Sawyer's Diner, Harlan Sawyer. Harlan Sawyer was in his late 50s. He did not work the floor of his diner most days. Linda Sawyer, his daughter-in-law, managed the day-to-day operation. But it was Harlan Sawyer who had taken the phone call the evening before the incident from a regular customer named Wanda Stills, a woman in her late 50s who had eaten at Sawyer's twice a week for years, and who had called Sawyer directly to tell him that she did not feel comfortable with the kind of clientele the diner was starting to attract, and that if things kept up this way, she might start going to the Cracker Barrel on the highway. Wanda Stills had not called the police, but Harlan Sawyer had called a friend of his, a friend who happened to work civilian dispatch at the Morrow Falls PD and had described a suspicious individual at his establishment. That friend had passed the description to the formal dispatch line, where it was logged as a call from a member of the public. The call, in other words, had not come from a random stranger who had happened to be in the diner. It had been orchestrated by the owner of the establishment in response to a complaint about the presence of a black customer. This fact, when it emerged, hit the national news with the force of a second explosion. The story was no longer just about 2 cops with bad judgment. It was about a network of petty, casual racism, a phone call to a buddy, a complaint about clientele, a dispatch log that obscured its own origins that had put a decorated veteran in the sights of a patrol officer with handcuffs drawn. Harlan Sawyer's Diner lost a significant portion of its business within weeks of his name becoming public. Several longtime vendors pulled their contracts. Linda Sawyer, who had known nothing about the call and was, according to sources close to the case, devastated by the revelation, resigned from her position. In a statement released through her son's social media, she wrote, "I have worked at this establishment for years, and I am ashamed that I did not speak up more forcefully in that moment. I am more ashamed to learn what I have now learned about how that moment was created. I wish Vance Caldwell nothing but peace and justice." Harlan Sawyer did not release a statement. His attorney advised against it. Wanda Stills, the woman whose complaint to Harlan Sawyer had started the chain of events, gave one interview to a local newspaper before going silent. In it, she said she had not meant for things to go that far and that she was not a racist. The interview was not received sympathetically. The comment section was shut down after hours. The wheels of official accountability turn slower than public opinion, but when they have enough to grip, they turn with considerable force. Garrett Harlan was terminated from the Morrow Falls Police Department soon after, a coincidence that was not lost on the internet after the internal investigation sustained findings of misconduct in the diner incident and in prior complaint cases, which were reopened in light of new evidence from Delaney's testimony and Tessa's file. He was additionally informed that the Georgia Attorney General's office was reviewing potential criminal charges related to the Maya Gaines detention and the alleged evidence tampering in the marijuana incident. Harlan's attorney, a man who specialized in representing law enforcement in misconduct cases, made a statement outside the courthouse in which he called the termination politically motivated and promised vigorous legal action. The statement was noted. The termination stood. Everett Dougal was suspended with pay pending a separate investigation into his conduct as a supervisor and the consistency with which he had cleared Harlan of misconduct findings. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened a parallel inquiry into whether Dougal's dismissals of complaints constituted a pattern of intentional misconduct. He retained his own attorney, a different one from Harlan's, which those close to the case noted as significant, since it suggested the two men were not presenting a unified defense. Sources within the department told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on background that Dougal and Harlan had not spoken since the termination. Reese Delaney was not fired. He was placed on a performance improvement plan and reassigned to administrative duties pending review of his own conduct in the incident, including his failure to intervene earlier. Tessa argued publicly that this was insufficient. The department argued that Delaney's cooperation with the investigation was a mitigating factor. The tension between those two positions was never fully resolved to anyone's satisfaction, which is perhaps the most realistic detail in this entire story. Accountability in real life is rarely clean. Delaney enrolled in a course on civil rights and policing offered through Georgia State University. His instructor later told colleagues privately that he was one of the most attentive students she had seen. Whether that meant anything in the long run was something only time would tell. Harlan Sawyer reached a civil settlement with Vance Caldwell months later. The terms were confidential. Sawyer did not admit wrongdoing in the settlement documentation. His attorneys had ensured that. But the amount described by sources familiar with the negotiations as substantial spoke its own language. The diner closed soon after, citing changed business conditions. The building sat empty for months before being leased to a Haitian-American family who converted it into a Caribbean restaurant called Blue Water Kitchen, which opened to strong reviews and a genuinely warm community reception. Chief Marcus Aldridge remained in his position, but faced a turbulent year. A coalition of community advocates pushed for deeper structural reforms at the department, and Aldridge, to the surprise of some and the cautious approval of others, engaged with those advocates directly. He implemented mandatory body camera activation protocols, revised the complaint review process to eliminate the possibility of supervisors reviewing complaints involving their own family members, and established a civilian review board with actual subpoena authority. Whether these reforms would outlast his tenure was a question he acknowledged openly and often. "I can build the structure," he told a town hall meeting. "The structure has to outlast the builder. That is the work. Elias Whitfield testified before a Georgia Senate Committee on Veteran Civil Rights. He spoke without notes. He described the Morrow Falls incident in detail, placing it in the broader context of what he called the particular debt this country owes to the men and women who served it, and then came home to face indignities no battlefield could have prepared them for. The room was very quiet while he spoke. At one point, a senator on the committee, a Republican from South Georgia, who had been skeptical going into the hearing, asked Whitfield whether he thought the system was fundamentally broken. Whitfield considered the question for a moment. "I think the system is full of people," he said, "and people can do better. The question is whether they choose to. The question is always whether they choose to." Vance Caldwell did not become a symbol willingly. He had spent his adult life doing things that could reasonably have made him famous. The action in the Korengal Valley alone, the details of which were documented in military records that were subsequently referenced in news stories, involved a level of physical courage that most people will spend their entire lives never needing to summon. He had not sought coverage of that. He did not seek coverage of the diner. What he sought in the weeks and months that followed was something closer to what he had been seeking when he walked into Sawyer's Diner in the first place. A meal, a moment of ordinary life lived without the weight of having to prove at every turn that he belonged in whatever space he was occupying. He gave several interviews at Tessa Langford's guidance because Tessa believed, and she was right, that Vance's specific combination of articulateness, composure, and moral clarity was a powerful force in the public conversation, and that disappearing from that conversation would be a waste of an opportunity to push for real change. Vance gave the interviews. He was honest in them. He did not perform anger because he was not performing. He was simply describing what had happened and what it meant in the precise, understated language of a man who has learned that the most devastating thing you can sometimes do is tell the truth without decoration. In the most widely viewed of these interviews, a sit-down with journalist Anna Reed on her podcast The Long Way Home, which focused on veterans issues, Vance said something that cut through the noise of the entire story and became, in its way, the statement that people return to most often. Reed had asked him what he felt in the moment when he realized Harlan was reaching for the handcuffs. Vance was quiet for a second. "Tired," he said. "Not scared. Not angry exactly. Or not just angry. Tired because I have been in places where people were actually trying to kill me. I have been in firefights. I know what real danger feels like. And the thing about that moment in the diner is that it was not danger. It was theater. It was a man with a badge performing power over someone he had decided did not deserve to push back. And I have been in that theater before. Not that exact diner, but that theater. And I am tired of it." He paused. "I called Elias because I knew Elias could cut through the theater. That is all the phone call was. It was not a magic trick. It was just knowing who to call. And the problem, the real problem, is that most people in my situation do not have that number. Most people do not have a general they can put on speaker. And what is supposed to happen to them?" The question hung in the air of the interview and was not answered because it was not the kind of question that has a clean answer. It was the kind of question that is supposed to be uncomfortable, that is supposed to linger. Vance returned home. He went back to his work. He ran a small landscaping and grounds maintenance business he had built over the years, employing other veterans and recently released young men who were trying to rebuild their lives. He went back to visiting Lena and Travis on weekends. He went back to being a person rather than a headline. He did one more thing, though. He filed paperwork to establish a nonprofit in partnership with Elias Whitfield and Tessa Langford, with funding commitments from veterans organizations and a private donor whose name has not been made public, called the Caldwell Whitfield Advocacy Fund. Its purpose, to provide free legal representation to veterans facing civil rights violations, with a particular focus on communities where institutional oversight is weak and the complaint process is compromised by exactly the kind of internal relationships that had protected Garrett Harlan for years. The fund accepted its first client soon after. By months later, it had a waiting list. Vance hired an executive director, a young black woman named Nadia Carter, a law school graduate who had turned down corporate positions to do this work, and set her loose on the waiting list with the same instructions he gave every person who worked for him. Do the job. Do it right. Do not let anyone tell you the job is not worth doing. It was not a revolution. It was not a tectonic shift in American policing. It was one fund with limited resources in one state. But as Elias Whitfield said at the small press event announcing its launch, held deliberately at the same Sawyer's Diner building, now transformed into Blue Water Kitchen, with its bright aqua walls and the smell of jerk chicken and fried plantain replacing the old smell of bacon grease. Every large thing starts somewhere small. The question is whether you start. Vance stood next to him at the podium in his olive drab jacket and said nothing. He did not need to. He had already said enough. This story has a protagonist, and it has antagonists, and it has a resolution that is imperfect but real. And because it has all of those things, because it is the kind of story that has a through line and a moral arc that bends eventually towards something that looks like justice, it was told, it was shared millions of times and covered by national outlets and discussed in Senate testimony. But Tessa Langford, in the weeks she spent building Vance's case, encountered the names of men and women who did not have an Elias Whitfield in their contacts. Men and women who had sat in their own corner booths, in their own towns, with their own handcuffs produced in front of their own silent diners, and who had made their calls and reached voicemail, or who had not known who to call, or who had been arrested before they could reach for the phone, or who had been arrested and not had their story filmed, or whose story had been filmed but not shared widely enough to break through the noise of a news cycle that has limited patience for stories that do not resolve cleanly. There was a man named Donovan Pierce in Valdosta who had been tasered in a grocery store parking lot after a manager called in a suspicious vehicle, Donovan's car, which happened to be in need of a new muffler. Donovan filed a complaint. It was dismissed. He had no general to call. There was a woman named Nadia Morrow in Gainesville who had been handcuffed in front of her own house after a neighbor called claiming to have seen someone breaking in. Nadia, who had locked herself out and was retrieving a spare key from her own flower pot. Nadia was a nurse. She was in her early 40s. She was handcuffed in her scrubs. Her complaint was dismissed after a supervisor determined that the officers had acted within protocol. There was a teenage boy named Jasper Perkins in Columbus, Vance's home city, who had been stopped multiple times for riding his bicycle in a suspicious manner. Jasper's mother had filed complaints each time. Each time, they were dismissed. Jasper was a teenager. He had no record. He was a member of his school's honor society and played trumpet in the marching band. These names are not in the Senate testimony. They are not in the CNN segment. They are in Tessa Langford's files and in the quiet institutional memory of advocacy organizations that track these things with painstaking care and in the memories of the people to whom they happened. Vance Caldwell knew about them because Tessa had told him about them, and because Vance had the kind of moral imagination that refuses to let a personal victory exist in isolation from the broader context that made it necessary. He mentioned Donovan Pierce by name in his interview with Anna Reid. He mentioned Nadia Morrow. He mentioned Jasper Perkins, whose mother had by that point connected with the Caldwell Whitfield Advocacy Fund and was on the waiting list. I want people to know, Vance said, that the reason this story got told is partly luck. I had the right person in my phone. I happened to be in a diner where someone was filming. The algorithm happened to move the video. None of that is justice. That is fortune. Justice would be a system that does not require you to get lucky. He paused. I was lucky, he said. Jasper Perkins should not have to be. This story is a work of narrative dramatization constructed to reflect patterns, dynamics, and injustices that are extensively documented in the real world. The names and specific events are fictionalized, but every element of this story, the anonymous complaint based on racial discomfort, the officer with a protected complaint record, the supervisor relationship that shielded him, the civilian who initiated the call through a backdoor connection, the veteran's composure in the face of unlawful detention, the critical role of an outside authority enforcing accountability, and the downstream ripple of legal action and reform reflects documented realities of how these situations unfold in American communities. The names used: Vance Caldwell, Garrett Harlan, Reese Delaney, Elias Whitfield, Tessa Langford, Everett Dougal, Harlan Sawyer, Linda Sawyer, Naomi Satchfield, Maya Gaines, Donovan Pierce, Nadia Morrow, Jasper Perkins, Nadia Carter, Jasper Blevins, are fictional. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. The dynamics they inhabit are not fictional. The dynamics are real. Vance Caldwell walked into a diner to eat breakfast. He walked out with handcuffs inches from his wrists, a retired general's voice echoing off the walls, and a story that changed lives, including his own. But here is the truth that matters more than any single story. Vance was lucky. He had the right number in his phone. Most people do not. The Nadia Morrows, the Jasper Perkinses, the Donovan Pierces of this world, they are still waiting for their version of that phone call. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, do not let it stop there. Hit that like button so more people find this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because we tell the stories that do not always make the front page. The ones where real people face impossible moments and choose to stand firm anyway. The stories that remind us what justice actually requires. We will be here every week. Do not miss the next one.